Welcome to the chapel of Robinson College here at the University of Cambridge. It's 2020, it's lockdown and it's Advent. And usually on Advent Sunday we have a carol service here in the chapel. But given the current restrictions, instead we have a series of recordings by our college choir and an interview with Professor Morna, who is Lady Margaret's Professor of Divinity Emerita and a founding fellow here at Robinson College. We begin our service, as usual, with a brief reading from Scripture.
Then the prophet said, "Listen, you house of David, not content with wearing out the patience of people, must you also wear out the patience of my God. Because you do so, the Lord of his own accord will give you a sign. It is this: a young woman is with child, and she will give birth to a son, and call him Emmanuel."
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of that light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth.
Professor Morna Hooker, a very warm welcome to Robinson College Chapel online. We've invited you to talk about Advent and Christmas, and I wonder if you could begin, since today is Advent Sunday, explaining something of what Advent entails.
Well, the word Advent comes straight out of a Latin word meaning coming. So it's basically about coming, the coming of Jesus. And of course, first of all, we think about the coming of Jesus at Christmas in Bethlehem. And so our thoughts turn towards Christmas and preparing for Christmas and all that entails. And for most of us, that quite often means that we're chasing around in the shops, looking for food and gifts and cards and stamps to send the cards, and it's all been taken over by preparation. Christmas is coming and the goose is getting fat, and we don't have much time actually to think about the significance of Christmas, which is what really traditionally Christians are supposed to be doing in Advent. But then there's the other side of Advent and the other side of coming, which is that we're looking forward to the second coming of Jesus. Traditionally, Christians have looked forward in Advent to the so-called second coming, the coming in judgment, and we're therefore supposed traditionally to be thinking thoughts that are more appropriate to judgment. And the church in the past has divided up the 4 Sundays of Advent into thinking about death, judgment, heaven and hell, which is very different from the other side of Christmas, where our jollifications have tended to take over and we're all blowing up balloons and pulling crackers and singing carols, rather than thinking about death and hell. The interesting thing is, of course, that this year, Advent has really overflowed. And for the last 9 months, we've been in a kind of Advent because our thoughts have been much more than usual on death and judgment and heaven and hell. And perhaps we've experienced that side of Advent more than usual.
It's interesting. I seem to remember Jürgen Moltmann distinguishing between Advent and future, and describing Advent as something that moves towards us as a gift, whereas future is something that we march into to conquer and to seize. How might that distinction, do you think, play out into the context that you've described as we see it at the moment?
Well, the idea of the future marching towards us, I suppose, is very much rather with us this year, isn't it? Because events have overtaken us in a way we weren't expecting. So that instead of being in control, we are rather feeling lost. Is that the distinction you had in mind?
I suppose, yeah. I mean, so it feels more like we're helpless recipients of whatever is coming in our direction.
Yeah, much more so. So the focus this year, I guess, is a little different and perhaps a little closer to what the church has traditionally thought we ought to be thinking about in Advent.
It doesn't stop us from hurrying around trying to forge our own future, I don't suppose.
No, I don't think it does. I think we want to be in control just the same. Yeah.
Well, the particular future that we talk about receiving in Advent is one based on hope. And I wonder if you could say something about what constitutes real hope, because for a lot of people, it tends to mean sitting around with our fingers crossed and our eyes closed to what's really happening. How would you explain hope?
Well, the very opposite of that, I think. Certainly not sitting around with one's eyes closed. That's a very dangerous thing to be doing. I think we should be well aware of events. But Christian hope isn't really just a question of crossing the fingers and hoping for the best. It's a hope that's founded on what God has done in the past. And I think this is where the 2 aspects of Advent come together, because our hope for the future is very much founded on what God has done in the past. So if God has come to us in the person of Jesus at Christmas, if he has acted in Jesus, if he has shown his love towards us in Jesus, then we can surely be confident that he will do that in the future.
In terms of hope as an active way of encountering the future, what kind of action might hope entail?
I think it would involve committing oneself to the significance of the Christian gospel, trying to demonstrate the love of Jesus, of God in one's daily life. And embracing, which we're not allowed to do at the moment, is it? Embracing metaphorically or literally other people who need our help. In other words, spreading the gospel, acting out, living the gospel, which is basically about God embracing us.
So you become a living embodiment.
Absolutely, yeah.
And yeah, as you say, there just seem to be a lot of darkness and gloom at the moment, and lots of people are articulating this in different ways, from the student body that we have at Robinson to some of our retired folk. And I suppose the question is, the text that we have today speak to some of that frustration and gloom. Can you say a little more about some of the readings that we hear in Advent?
Well, yes, the very traditional reading, which we hear, especially on Christmas Day, of course, is the reading from John 1, where we read about the Word being made flesh. And that passage goes on to talk about the coming of the Word, who is in fact the embodiment of light, which is precisely what we need in darkness and gloom. And it uses the very interesting idea of light. Light is very vulnerable, and especially in first century Palestine, when this passage was originally written, because one was very conscious of the fact that a candle can so easily blow out, which is something we all know about when we try to light the candles on the Advent wreath, of course, because they don't always keep alight when we want them to. Light is very vulnerable, and John 1 talks about that, and the fact that light is vulnerable, and yet insists that this light has not gone out. The darkness attempted to swamp it, but couldn't swamp it. And I think what we have seen, especially during this year, is the fact that although the news has been so gloomy that one has hardly dared switch on the radio or television to listen to what's happened, there have been these glimmers of light and very large chinks of light, where we have seen people going out of their way to help their neighbours, where we have seen NHS staff performing great acts of self-sacrifice, really, in order to help people. So the light has flickered, but continued and grown. And now perhaps we see even more light dawning with the hope of the vaccine, which people have been working so hard to produce. So there is light in our darkness.
I like the language of the darkness not swamping the light. You're known at Robinson sometimes as the fellow who wrote the Bible. And I seem to recall the translation of the New Testament, the Revised English Bible, that you oversaw. And if I've remembered this properly, John 1, they call the Johannine prologue, that moment where you translate the darkness has not overcome the light. It could mean either understood or overcome. And you have a beautiful way of dealing with that ambiguity or that dual focus.
Well, we spend a very long time trying to find a word that would convey the ambiguity of the Greek word. Some translations go for couldn't overcome it. Some go for couldn't understand it, as you say. But we eventually, after hours racking our brains, came up with the word master it, because the idea of mastering is controlling, overcome, defeating, but it's also to understand. So we hope that this conveyed both meanings.
That must have been a proper eureka moment, or,
Yes,
or a hallelujah moment. I'm not sure which.
It was a colleague of mine, a famous New Testament scholar, G.B. Caird.
Oh, was that his?
it was his, yeah.
This term's talks have been loosely and very loosely at times, as you know, based on the fall of Jerusalem's great temple. How would you understand the relationship between that temple in the first century and the theme of Advent?
Well, in fact, they belong very closely together, I think. Interestingly, of course, the Christian movement began just before the fall of the temple. But already before the temple, when the temple was still there, Christians had begun to think of Jesus as, in a sense, a replacement for the temple. And the reason for that is that the temple was built as an attempt to be a place where God would be met by his people. In a way, it's an absurd notion because God is everywhere and one can meet him, as people often say, in a garden or out in the countryside. But there is a feeling that people want to devote a special place where they can come and be in the presence of God. So it is the place where God and Israel were thought to come together, the place where men and women were reconciled to God, and felt that they were in God's presence and that they were in fellowship with him. And what the early Christians were experiencing was that with the coming of Christ, who they saw as God with us, Emmanuel, to use the word used by the prophet Isaiah. God was with us, and in a sense, one didn't need a temple because through our fellowship with Christ, we were in the presence of God. And then, of course, the temple was destroyed, which was devastating for the Jews. But Christians had by then discovered this notion that in their fellowship with one another, by meeting together with Christ, they were in the presence of God. So they came to think of the church as a kind of temple where God could be met.
Do you think it's fair to say that some of the earliest Christian communities may well have understood themselves as temple-less forms of Judaism?
Yes, indeed. And that is not such an unusual idea because already we have the Qumran community, which is quite well known, who had gone out into the wilderness and were doing without the temple and who thought of themselves in a way as a temple. So that the notion that a community could be a place where God was present was already there in Judaism. And there is no reason why the Christian understanding, though it may seem rather quaint to us, was in fact such a jump. And already, of course, in the Old Testament, there had been protests by people saying, but you shouldn't pin down God to a temple. If we do, we're trying to limit God. And God is not to be confined to a temple. And maybe, I mean, it's very interesting that this year, of course, we've had to do not only without our meetings in the chapel at Robinson, but in many churches, there have been no services. And we've all got used to meeting other Christians on Zoom or some other way. And realize that actually you don't actually need a building, though it's very nice as a way of coming together. But God isn't confined to buildings, and God goes on. And as we've seen already, God is at work in the way in which people have helped one another in the community. And I see that as a demonstration of the fact that God is with us.
And this is partly how St. Paul understood some of the early Christian communities when they functioned this way.
Indeed, and he is one of the people who went to town, as it were, on this notion of the community as a temple.
Mm. And the final question then, what do you think is lost by our inability to meet in person?
Oh, I think it's very difficult to experience the sense of awe that you get sometimes in a service. The experience of being in company. I mean, okay, a Zoom meeting, we've all got used to them, but we Zoom this and we Zoom that and we Zoom the other. But it's the meeting together physically, I think, is good. Doesn't need to be in a particular building, doesn't need to be in a temple. But I think the coming together, the recognition that with a Christian faith isn't just about you and God. It isn't about just me and God. It's about you and me and God. It's a three-dimensional thing. And the ability to go to a building or meet in the open air or wherever, in a house, in a special building, it takes us somewhere where we aren't if we're just on our own and a screen in front of us.
That brings us all the way back to the first reading, I suppose. The emphasis on full-blown physicality of togetherness is precisely where John seems to be going with the word became flesh.
Yes, God is with us. And he's with us particularly in Jesus, but now also with us through our fellow Christians and with our neighbours. He is there for us to meet.
So the word becomes flesh in our utter togetherness in that sense.
Yeah, I would say so.
Well, Professor Morna Hooker, thank you very much and happy Advent to you.
And to you.